Breaking the cycle to step forward. Authentic conversations from lived experience and a professional perspective in overcoming abuse with Chris Tuck and Beverly Ann.
Hello and welcome to Breaking the Cycle to Step Forward. I'm Beverly Ann and I'm joined as always by my lovely co-host.
Hi everyone, it's Chris here.
And today we have a wonderful guest, Elaine Wilkins. Hello, Elaine.
Hi, Bev. Hi, Chris. Lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
No, it's a pleasure. And instead of us introducing you, Elaine, would you just like to introduce people who you are? So where you currently are in life?
Well, I had the great privilege of meeting Beverly firstly. We met on the yoga mat, actually, didn't we, Bev? And
We did.
At the time, you were very poorly, and I can remember that you could do very limited amount of yoga, and we just you started speaking to me and we just hit it off. And because I actually am the founder of the Chrysalis Effect, which is an organization that I set up 15 years ago, following my own illness, chronic illness for 6 years. I had a diagnosis of ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis / chronic fatigue syndrome. People use different namings for those illnesses, and we got talking about the Chrysalis Effect and the fact that it was a recovery pathway that I developed out of my experience of being so unwell and being pretty much told that I had to live with a long-term chronic illness. And it was devastating to the family to hear that. It was devastating to me. And I did all the kind of things that people do. You know, I did the revolving door of the NHS, tried every therapist-ologist, you name it. And then to be left with that damning kind of diagnosis at such a young age with young teenage kids. And I just could not accept that. So through my, multiple symptoms, which was sort of migraines, brain fog, absolute exhaustion, bedbound for long periods of time, and IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. I had neurological symptoms were awful. So my cognitive abilities had declined to where I couldn't work anymore. And I had like loss or weird sensation down one side of my body. So for me, being left with that illness without answers meant that I used to really worry that I had something very serious and undiagnosed, and kept me, really terrified, but at the same time determined that I wasn't going to live like this forever. So I did eventually recover. It did take 6 years of trial and error. It was expensive. I wasn't working, so I was having to borrow money from family to try this treatment and that treatment. But ultimately, I realized, I learned along the way how much stress I'd been under as an individual, how I had actually been under stress since childhood, really. And at the time, I didn't have the words for ACE, adverse childhood experiences. And I know we're going to talk about that today. But I didn't have the words for that or the understanding of it. But I had become, as an adult, very driven, very much a perfectionist, working all the hours God send, and always overgiving and there for everybody. And I just thought that was me, but actually ended up that it was part of the factors of why I became ill. And so I think the day that you and I got talking, Bev, I was able to sort of listen a bit to your story and tell you what I did. And I think a little light bulb went on for you that I think you'd had lots of different, asthma diagnosis, and you had trouble breathing, you couldn't walk very far and things. So I think it was one of those wonderful synchronicities where light bulbs started to go on, that perhaps you needed to look into some of the work we were doing around chronic fatigue.
Absolutely. And there's something that you say as well. You don't know what you don't know.
No.
And whilst intuitively, you want to get better, And I was diagnosed as a chronic asthmatic, and I went to yoga just to learn how to breathe.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that to think about doing down dog or anything like that, that was like, no. At that time, never. I didn't say never, but my focus was about going and stretching and breathing, and you know, we'll go into that more with the recovery. You met Chris later on in the journey, didn't you?
And then I met Chris, yeah, and I met Chris, I think, when we were actually doing the resilience film. You were screening resilience film, weren't you, to raise the awareness of adverse childhood experiences and trauma and unprocessed trauma. And I think I came and I was on one of the panels where we were going to answer some questions and things. I think that's when I first met you, Chris, wasn't it? And found out all the amazing work you do to give, you know, awareness and voice to those people suffering from childhood abuse.
Yeah, indeed. There's a lot of commonality, isn't there, across the board when it comes to unprocessed emotions, impact stored within the body, and just empowerment that we need to take on board in order to get ourselves well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the more, you know, my background's education and training. So for me, coming through that illness and realizing that I'd been seeking and searching for answers that people didn't have. And that was GPs, that was hospital consultants, and that was also lots and lots of therapists and practitioners who were great in their own way. They could do their, you know, their therapy very well. But when I asked questions or tried to get to that root cause, because I had this conviction, if I could find out what's led to this, what's caused me to get so ill, I can then start addressing those things. And I absolutely knew that it would then fall away. I've been recovered now over 17 years, fully recovered, and lived a full life. And I just couldn't bear the thought of leaving people in that position that I was in, not knowing that recovery is possible, because it was never once said to me. And the fact that, you know, it was actually the approach that needed to change, and that approach needed to be that people needed education. They needed to understand what had happened to their body, why they were struggling like they were, and then of course what to do about it, and then have support from, you know, I'm a great believer in role models. You know, I found one person when I was ill that was working in this field who'd recovered, and I just listened and listened to what that one person said, because I think if you know, if you want to do something, find someone who's already done it, has always been my sort of motto, you know. And that was, but when I think back to starting the Chrysalis Effect, which was just about letting people know recovery was possible, and sharing some research that I did, because my research, you know, in medicine, they research disease, don't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
I flipped it on its head, and what I wanted to do, I knew what I'd done to recover, but I wanted to find other people who'd fully recovered and interview them and see if I could find some common denominators. Oh my goodness. So that sort of started it all. And I interviewed 30 people. I managed to find them. And it's funny when you're supposed to be doing something in life, because I was talking to people about what I was doing, and people go, oh, I know somebody that you might want to talk. And that was how it happened. So out of those 30 people, literally every single one of them had done these 8 things in order to recover. They'd addressed 8 areas. And so that became the foundation for me to say to people, look, recovery is possible. It wasn't just me. All these other people have recovered as well by addressing those areas. And that was the foundation. Right back in 2009, we started. And we had to take it online because obviously people were too poorly to travel anywhere. The first workshop I was going to run, nobody could come to because they were in bed. So it sort of grew from there. And then very quickly, I realized that it was important that those practitioners that didn't know how to support this, what led up to it, what, you know, they also needed some education. So the other arm of our business was born, which was so we, you know, we're helping people recover, but we built a community, and then educating and accrediting those practitioners, clinicians and therapists so that they've also got the full picture as well. So that's what we've been doing really over the last 15 years, and aiming to make it accessible, to make recovery accessible at point of GP referral. And it took years, but eventually we got the opportunity, dream come true really, to run pilots in the NHS, which we've now concluded. They've been evaluated by Oxford University, and to be able to actually have, on that particular pilot, 69 GP surgeries referring patients that were coming in for all their different symptoms and offering them a recovery pathway. It was just amazing and so great to be able to help people that thought there was no help.
Fantastic. And, you know, I obviously know all about this because I'm very proud to say that I'm accredited by the Chrysalis Effect as a specialist recovery practitioner, and I specialise in trauma. So, and obviously Chris has met you several times, so I love, you know, what's been happening with your journey, because that's been some big visions for you. But let's go right back now to actual ACEs, because Chris and I speak about this, and we hear a lot of things talked about adverse childhood experiences and ACEs. And, you know, Chris and I talk about it in general, you know, during the podcast, but I think it's really important, you know, to really recognise and understand ACEs and to go back to the beginning. So, you know, how it all started.
Okay, well, I'll tell you how it started for me. As we were going through and we were getting health profiles coming in from clients over the years, the themes kept jumping out about different things. And what we knew was that most people really did, well, actually, pretty much everyone resonated with this idea of being highly sensitive. So almost having like that hair-like trigger switch in them that would tip them over into feeling very sort of anxious or stressed. So and we discovered through the sort of biopsychosocial approach and working with you know, eminent sort of nutritional therapists and people, we really understood the mechanisms and the systems in the body, and understood that many of the people that end up with the diagnosis that we work with have been living for years in like a sympathetic dominant state. So their sympathetic nervous system is easily triggered, and because they've been under sort of chronic toxic stress, instead of the that fight or flight coming in for a short space of time and then being able to be calmed down by the parasympathetic nervous system, that living under toxic stress means that parasympathetic nervous system becomes desensitized. The feedback loop becomes desensitized. So it means that the system is under this chronic stress all the time, and it has a knock-on effect on creating a lot of symptoms. It shuts down your gut, which impacts your immune system. It shuts down your cognitive function, all of these things. So we kind of knew that there was this heightened sensitivity there. What we didn't really know was kind of why. And I was sent an email one day from, you'll know her, Beverly, Liz Hancock. And Liz Hancock is one of our team. She's got many modalities under her belt, and she'd worked in relationship counselling for many years, and she had specialised in pain, and she'd made the links. She often, when she was doing her relationship counselling, she would say, "Are you having any physical pain as well?" And people would go, "Yes." And of course, you can't sort of separate the two, can you? Our emotional and physical side. So Liz sent me this email, and it was an article called "Are Family Secrets Making You Sick?" And I read it, and it was amazing. It was actually explaining about the work of Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Robert Anders. And I read it, and I've gone goose pimply just thinking about it, because I'd got to that stage, I'd got through recovery, we'd been working with people for many years, and here it was. There was all this about adverse childhood experiences, and it explained about the Felitti, how Dr. Felitti discovered this as well, and the huge implications that it has had for understanding why we go on to develop the illnesses that we develop in life. So my ears pricked up. So I started to read about the ACE trial, and it was actually the Kaiser Permanente study that Dr. Felitti took part in. And I'll come to that in a second, because that was born out of the fact that he was in preventative medicine in the States, and he was running an obesity trial. And it was putting people, they were quite significantly obese people round about their age of sort of 50s, and many of them had lost loads of weight on this obesity program that he put them on, and they lost all this weight and they were delighted. And then they were following through to see how people progressed, and noticed that people were piling the weight back on, piling it back on. And he was so obviously upset about this and not sure why, because people had seemed pleased to lose the weight, that he just literally picked up the phone, started talking to people. And after speaking to someone for a little while, this lady must have really trusted him, and she started to tell him about some abuse that she'd experienced as a child, and it was sexual abuse. And it's sort of something just, I don't know, just spoke to him, in that he thought, well, I need to find out if there's anything else in people's childhoods that could have any of this, you know, link. So he did, and he called all these patients, and more and more and more of them were revealing different forms of childhood adversity and abuse. So at a similar time, Dr. Robert Anders was doing similar work. It's funny, again, that's synchronicity. And they came together. And what they did, they were commissioned to do the Kaiser Permanente study. So that was 17,000 adults in America. These weren't from deprived backgrounds or disadvantaged backgrounds necessarily. Everyone was an insured person that had medical care, which of course they have to have in the States, don't they? So these were professionals. They were, you know, across all walks of life that were medically insured. And because these patients were in their 50s, they wanted to find out what illnesses that they were struggling with. And so doing the research and asking the questions, they came out of it with 3 distinct types of adversity that affect us in our adulthood. And that is neglect, abuse, and household dysfunction. So in terms of neglect, that can be physical neglect, not having the care that you needed. It can be emotional neglect, you know, not having your caregivers being emotionally available for you. And it can also be in, you know, not being having a warm home and clothes and food and all of those things. So really practical sort of neglect. And then there's abuse, which was sexual, physical, or emotional. And then there was household dysfunction, and the household dysfunction looked at various categories. And that was it was living with a person with mental health issues, living with an adult who is using substances, so alcohol, drugs, those kinds of things. It's also if you had a family member incarcerated, and when they're talking about childhood, they're talking about up to the age of 18. That was how they sort of quantified it. And there's various other things that would have happened in the home, and divorce is one of those as well.
Yeah.
And so you know, if there's a family breakup that's happened, and these 3 categories, they formulated questions from each of those categories, and then they formed something called an ACE score. So there were 10 questions that covered those 3 categories, and you can go online, anyone can go on and do their original ACE score. We've since, and we'll talk about this, we've since expanded it, because it, you know, by today's standards, it's quite narrow view really of the sorts of things that can happen to children. And there's a lot of things that can happen outside the home, aren't there? But for you know, what we have to really appreciate, Dr. Felitti and Dr. Anders, is the fact that they're the forefathers of bringing this awareness of what happens to children when they're small has such an incredible impact on our physical and emotional health, and not just that, but our outcomes as adults as well, even down to the kind of incomes that we can earn. But what they correlated with these sort of people was the illnesses, and started to come up with the correlation between the number of ACEs that you have experienced as a child to the likelihood and increased chances that you would have of developing illnesses like stroke, cancers, heart attacks, autoimmune, addiction, and so on. So, you know, the big ones, the ones that, you know, we all, you know, don't want to end up with. And of course, from my perspective, all these years on, there's been enough studies now that have corroborated all of this. And it's also shown me that that people that have had ACEs in their childhood have got a 600% more likelihood of developing ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia. So it was a massive aha moment reading that article. And then from there, I started to look into it a lot more, read around it. And then I don't even know how I knew about this, but the Scotland were running an ACE Aware Nation conference, and I went.
And that was before, that was about 2018, wasn't it? Yeah, or 2019?
2018. So if you think about, we started the Chrysalis Effect in 2009, and we knew about sensitivity, and we knew that people had often talked about having dysfunctional relationships and difficulties and various challenges. But here it was in black and white, showing us that what had happened to children, you know, and then there's things like the reading around it, body keeps the score, you know, and the work of Felitti, you know, saying that, you know, what happens to a child in their early years, the body will present its bill later. And then I interviewed Dr. Bernie Siegel, who was a pediatric oncologist, and he was very much of exactly the same sort of view as well. But on a personal level, when I went to the conference, I went for education to, you know, really learn more. And it was a 2-day conference. And honestly, my father grew up in Glasgow, had a really tough childhood. You know, they were a very poor family. They'd migrated from Ireland. They lived in the Gorbals, which is the really tough district of Glasgow. He never talked an awful lot about his childhood, but I know it was very, very tough. And as with a lot of Glaswegian adults, he died young. And so going to this conference and learning more, learning that the fact that Glasgow took this on to become ACE aware as a nation out of a project within the legal system where they were trying to reduce violence in Scotland, and also look at why they had such terrible mortality rates where adults die so much younger.
And that's the part, I don't know about you, Chris, when you first hear all that, that's a bit that's really strikes home, and there'll be lots of people hearing that. And I think it's important to say as well that the experiences you have, because there is some controversy about the actual scoring. I think personally it's good to have an awareness. So when you do your score, it's yes or no. It's not about asking the history at that time. And for me, I think what's really good about that and important about that is, and we've often said this, when we're growing up, we think our life is normal.
Completely.
It's what we know. We don't know anything else. And so it's when you go through the questionnaire that you see it, sometimes it actually gives you an understanding. Oh, this has an impact. Oh, that has an impact. And I don't know about you, Chris, because I don't want to speak on your behalf, but it's quite shocking at first when you receive this information.
Yeah, well, I was an 8. I don't know about you, Chris, but a 10.
10. Yeah.
So I can remember feeling really quite shaken and scared. Yes, I could understand why I'd got so ill and why I'd got chronically ill. But what I think the heartening thing about going to the conference was seeing how people had, once they've got awareness, there is so much that we can do in order to process that trauma, which can resolve it in the body and release it from the body. And that was the bit I was really excited about. This wasn't just us all finding out that we've got some terrible end, inside. It was about the fact that our bodies works epigenetically in the certain we might have a propensity to develop an illness, but it's our environment. That's what I learned on that conference. It's the environment. If we're in we might be a child that's had a very difficult delivery. We may have had a very depressed mum, and we may have been separated from our mother, and we may have had those early attachment issues, which are a form of adverse childhood experience. But if that's mitigated by we were surrounded by love, understanding and care, and we got our needs met, then those genes that would lead to those illnesses don't get expressed. And similarly, if they have started to get expressed and we get the right help, support, trauma release work, understanding, and we learn what we need in terms of environment to surround ourselves with an environment that keeps us well and happy and regulated, because the nervous system with ACEs means that we get dysregulated, don't we, very quickly, and get triggered into that fight or flight. So for me, that was my learning ears were up. I think, well, now what we can do is show people that this is possible if you don't address it and face it and get the help. But you can do that, and it doesn't mean that we've got life sentences.
Absolutely.
I'm going to jump in.
I was going to leave it. I can see your hands up.
I've been writing away as you've been talking, Elaine. I find it fascinating that we've come, and Beverly, that we've all come at this. We've all come to the same conclusions, but we've all come at it from different ways of coming at it.
Yes.
So you said you started your organization in 2009, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And that you found out all of this information from your symptoms that you were and illnesses that you were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So I came at this from a breakdown that I had after I had my first child in 98 to 2000. So there was a mental health breakdown there. I didn't know that's what it was, because I just didn't. I didn't know what had caused it, but I could really align with the fact that you were saying that you were always a giver, you always worked, you never gave yourself space, you never gave yourself that time off, you're a perfectionist. I can identify with all of that, as I know Bev can. In 2003, I became a health and wellness coach because I felt and knew that if I could find that causal reason why I had that mental breakdown, then I could actually empower myself to get well as well. I didn't know what that meant, didn't know what it looked like, did not know nothing. Anyway, become a health and wellness coach in 2003. And then that's when I started looking at what may have caused what I'd gone through. Again, I didn't know nothing about the Felitti study, didn't know anything about ACEs until 2016. Okay. But between 2003 and 2016, I came at it from a point of view that my mental health was impacting my physical health, and I could see that through what I was going through. The bulimia, the hip replacements, the anal prolapses that I was having operations for. Health, even though I felt healthy and well because I knew no different, my body and my brain was telling me different, and I didn't know what it was telling me at the time until I started going, something else is going on here. I read The Boy Called It, about all of the abuse that he suffered. So I didn't know anything about symptoms. I was going from it from an abuse side of state of being. And I'm thinking, oh, that's interesting. That led me on to reading about other people's abuse stories. It led me into reading about trauma. Oh, what does that word mean? Oh, what causes that then? Oh, how can I recover from that? So it just led from one thing to another to another. So I came to the same conclusions as you, that adverse childhood experiences do cause and have catastrophic impact on mental and physical health if you don't do anything about it. So here, education is absolute key and awareness is absolute key. So I'm going to shut up there because it is now caught up with your story and where you're coming from.
I think it's important.
It is important to know that you're coming from it from two different things. And I learned from a lot of people in the health and fitness industry, because obviously that's my job, that's where I live, so to speak. And the people that I were following were talking about childhood experiences, not adverse childhood experiences, because that wasn't in my vocabulary, but just experiences that you have as children, and abuse. And that was a dirty word, that was a taboo subject, that wasn't talked about. But do you know, if you suffered with that when you was growing up, that it could actually have impacted you? And I'm like, ears prick up, and I'd go and delve a bit deeper. But what I want to say to all our listeners before we carry on, Elaine, is that trauma is a normal and natural response to the abnormal things that we may have experienced, what have either happened around us or what has happened to us. So we are not responsible for any of that. However, as an adult, if we feel that we are not well mentally, physically, we do have the power and the choice to change that as adults. So I just wanted to leave that hanging, because if everybody follows our podcast, they know what I mean by all of that.
And I just want to caveat that quickly, because when you say about how you came through for me, I went down the therapy path first of all, and that was after having children. I'd gone to go through the therapy path in my 20s, but it was just too big. It was like a Pandora's box. It was like, if I keep it shut, it won't matter. That's my past. I'm going forward. I'm not living in my past. But it was after having children that it wasn't postnatal depression, which I do feel is part of trauma as well. I'm very passionate about that. It was not realizing that my children were mirroring what I hadn't had as a child, but also that bigger fear, as we've spoken about before. If I've been abused, will I abuse my children? So I started through the therapy route, but became seriously ill. You know, I had meningitis back then, bacterial meningitis, had shingles of the mouth. And so now looking back, I can see how my body kept crashing. And it was only over the years, once I'd been finally, that was what Elaine calls the tipping point. You know, when there's a straw that breaks the camel's back, and that was my final last crash over many years, and being diagnosed and literally being floored. My body was like, enough, no more. So it's just really interesting. And I think the other thing is, and I know I'm jumping the gun here and I'm going to be, but it's the passion coming through. Sometimes, we've spoken about a documentary called Resilience, and we'll put the link to that underneath so people can find out more, because knowledge is power. But people have this connotation that, oh, you must have come from a poor family to have adverse childhood experiences, or you've all been abused. That's not true. And in fact, there's actually a BBC documentary on with Earl Spencer sharing some of his experience. And one of the biggest misnomers is about boarding school. So, when you've got a young child being looked after by someone else other than their birth parents, they're looked after children. And whether you're in a children's home or whether you're in a boarding school, the impact for that child, they don't care who's paid for it or what the name comes under. they know they're not living with their parents and it's not their choice. And that can have a big impact.
And it comes under abandonment, doesn't it, as well? Because the children, as a child, we don't understand why adults make the decisions that they make. And if that decision ends up hurting us, then we feel somehow it's something we've done wrong. And, you know, I think it's really worth listening to that Earl Spencer's interview, because I found it very moving. I listened to it on Sunday morning, and it wasn't just at boarding school. It was the highly privileged family. His sister, Princess Diana, and himself were looked after by nannies, as were his two older sisters, and they were physically abused at home in their, you know, in their privileged setting. So, you know, it's got nothing to do really with how much money's coming in through the front door, is it? But I think going back to the film Resilience, on that film is where I came across, I think, is it Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris?
Yes.
And that was the reason I was very keen to go to Scotland, because she was going to be the keynote speaker. And she was incredibly inspirational. You can't argue with anything she says in terms of how we have to understand that this is it's actually been coined, and I believe it wholeheartedly, that ACE and trauma is the theory of everything. Because, you know, whatever people are struggling with, we have to look back and see where that sort of came from, and whether that's a physical illness or an emotional health or a mental health issue or whatever. And in my experience of the work that I'm doing now, after going to that event, and I could talk for ages about it really, it was life-changing. I cried for 2 days. I heard Glaswegian accents who sounded just like my dad talking about their tough childhoods and the amount of alcohol and things that was in their childhood, and how addiction came about, and how anger and rage, and how, you know, all of these things are part of the picture. And, you know, I knew in my family, my dad was a hard-working man who adored his children, but he had demons, and I will never know what they were, because in that generation didn't talk to you. We didn't have those sorts of conversations. But I had a really tricky relationship with my dad, and it gave me such compassion and such understanding for what that culture is like in Scotland, where, you know, when he would have been growing up, women would have been beaten. That would have been completely normal. Everybody drank really heavily. I remember big gatherings of that family, you know, and they all were drinkers. And so I didn't even realize I'd grown up with that, you know, and this is where we get into intergenerational, you know. These are hardworking people that had a family. And, you know, my mum had lost her mother when she was 14. She'd lost her father when she was 3. She'd had to step up and be responsible at such a young age. And I remember little snippets of her story. So you get 2 people dealing with trauma. Also, they've been through the wars, through wars, you know, and they're bringing up their children the best way that they knew how. But something that stands out for me learning about this, and as Chris said, you know, the more you learn, the more you read. When it was explained to me that small t trauma are the daily things that impact us, and that actually small t trauma is anything that overwhelms a child's capacity to cope.
Yeah.
And also, trauma can be not getting what you need.
Yeah.
It's not that you've been beaten, because that's what often happens. People say, well, actually, my parents were really good, and, you know, this didn't happen and that didn't happen. But actually, when we delve a little bit deeper, if you were that highly sensitive child, if you did find certain situations or environments difficult, and you were teased for that, or criticized for that, for who you were, then you learn very early on that you're not okay. And the not okayness is where we start finding ways to feel better about ourselves. And, for me, that was workaholism, it was sugar, it was drama, there was always something going on in my life that was stressful and dramatic. And that's it's all part of the picture. Nothing pleases me now more than to have a peaceful life and a simple life. And that, doesn't mean that I've not been able to achieve my goals and dreams. I just do it in a very, very different way, because people that haven't learned self-care for themselves, they can't teach you it, can they? So I didn't have any self-care, really. I just pushed my body to the limit, because actually staying busy stopped me from feeling the emotional pain. And I think that's something that people really do resonate with when they start to learn about this stuff. And so trauma is really, it's not, the thing I want to share that's the most positive, and why I'm so passionate about this, is that we were asked by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, if you've been here, you are here, we're all in this together. This is not about professionals. It's not about doctors. This is about individual people knowing this stuff. And we are a movement that can have these conversations, share this information, and we can make a difference. And I want you each to commit to be part of this movement. And I mean, it was such an incredible conference. And I also learned that Scotland have joined everything up. They've got an infrastructure from early years education, nursery schools, their NHS, their primary schools, their secondary schools, their legal systems, their police and their policy makers. They're all trauma informed, which means that they're looking at what's happening to children now. They're buffering those experiences, which means that those children they're going to be shortcutting what we're trying to do for adults. They're going to be giving children what they need now, so that they don't go on to have this terrible fallout from high ACE scores and things. So they've literally made a commitment as a nation, and that's what I want to be part of in the UK. And I came away from that, and the first thing I did was change all our health profiles and put the ACE questions, modified ones, and Beverly, I got you to thank for that as well, because we realized that there was this disconnect between what's happening outside of the home, those other things that can impact children, especially now in this social media driven, we've only got to look at the number of young people with eating disorders, that's coming out of all the Instagram culture, and also the fact that we might have been bullied at school as kids, but we came home and left it at school. That doesn't happen anymore. That's 24/7 on their phones. So we expanded some questions on our thing, and the result is that I've actually been able to gather data from patients for the NHS to show that those patients that have been doing the rounds of the healthcare system for years and years and years, and have been written off as chronic long-term patients that are left on benefits to rot, actually, if anybody had asked them what happened to them, their ACE scores were highly significant, and between 90 and 97% of them that came through all had significant ACEs, and nobody had ever asked them that, but they'd had surgeries and thousands of appointments and tests, and nobody could find the answer.
No, and that has a huge impact, because let's be honest, we're talking about when you're children, you can still be in a loving family home, but if your environment at school, if you're being bullied mercilessly every day, imagine being a child walking into that atmosphere. I know as an adult I wouldn't like it, let alone being a child.
Exactly.
The clubs and all different things, but it means that we don't often have the language. And so when we're not being asked as adults, even, we still don't have the language, because we don't know how to communicate it, and there's a lot more that can still happen, and it's something we're all passionate about. and you've actually started moving in that direction. And I know you can't tell everything, but there's something that you're doing at the moment go forward.
Yeah, so I really was serious about that commitment, because I feel intergenerational trauma, is huge. Hurt people, we know that. And we replicate sometimes the behaviors that we've witnessed as children. I definitely wasn't the best mum in the world to my young, when I was a young mum, because I was probably trying to control my environment like mad, which meant to some extent controlling my kids. I loved them and I gave them, I thought, all the things I never had, but I was still being triggered and I was still reacting to things, and trying to make them well behaved and liked, and so that can be seen as conditional love. I love my kids unconditionally, but I don't know that always came across. And it was only learning this I had to look at my role as a parent, and I can't turn back the clock, but what I can do is have conversations, and I can have a different, respectful, loving relationship with them now. And I do believe that I've broken a lot of the cycle, and it's meant that my grandchildren are benefiting. So that's why I think this is so important on that level. And also, family estrangement is huge. When we do start to look at this work, sometimes we see we've got these very difficult relationships with siblings and parents and things, and that's been part of my life, which is a deep sadness. But I had to make a decision about what keeps me well and what keeps me feeling safe, because a lot of this is around safety. And just I must mention this, because part of the trauma-informed coaching programs that we teach now, because we want to spread the word to as many people that are interacting with clients and patients and things, is I always assumed there'd be a hierarchy of trauma. And I'll be honest, I always thought that, in my head, sexual abuse as a child has to be, it was the number one. That's what I thought would be the absolute worst. But what we learn from people that work in this all the time, and Dr. Felitti specifically said that actually humiliating a child publicly is probably leaves one of the most deepest impacts. And so actually it's not about somebody's trauma being worse than yours, it's about what it meant to you at the time and the impact that has had on your life since, because we can get triggered, because all of those memories that can be even unconscious memories for when we were, before we could speak, separation, not having that sort of gaze, the right gaze from the early primary caregiver, any of those things, that's stored as a feeling memory and our body reacts to it. And so that's sometimes why we can get angry or upset or anxious, and we don't really know why we've had such a reaction. And so I think, I was a great one for saying, oh, well, my situation isn't as bad as that person's. That person's had far worse experience than me. And literally, closing off the fact that my experience had a big impact on me and hurt me a lot, And so I think that's another important factor. Please don't think because, your experience wasn't the same as someone else, it doesn't mean that it was any less of an impact on you. And I think that's where the respecting people's experiences comes in, doesn't it?
And I just want to caveat that about humiliation, because we don't like to shy away from things, but sexual abuse, there's humiliation in that. It's the shame, it's the guilt. So when you've been humiliated, it's the shame and the guilt that comes with that. With sexual abuse, with physical abuse, with emotional abuse, it's the additional breaking of boundaries, personal boundaries.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about sexual abuse, you're talking about emotional and physical, really,
Exactly.
because so I don't want anyone who's listening who's a survivor of abuse thinking that they're not being understood, in any way. So just wanted to caveat that, because
and I think I think you're
everyone's
right, Bev, and I
experience
think
is personal.
yeah, it is. And I mean, I just think Gabor Mate says it's what happens inside you when that event happens. That's the thing. So, you know, we can only live within our own experiences, can't we? And so what we experience to us, it can be huge, because that's all we know. That's what's happened
And
to us.
also, it's as adults, and it's something Chris and I have spoken about as well. Some people can sort of say you're cold or you're hard, you don't understand. And it's not that. It's just, you know, if I go back to 2 different experiences when I was 4, the first time I was abused by my dad, I didn't have the words. I still have the full memory. I can tell you the feelings. I didn't have the words to it. That was the worst. When I was actually picked up by the police and taken with my siblings, with my mum, into the back of a police van at the age of 4 and taken to the police station and taken into care, to some people, that is horrific. But to me, it wasn't. It was actually, looking back, I obviously was scared, but at the time I wasn't scared in the same way as I was with my abuse. So my levels of coping and resilience probably are much higher than some people, because that's what I've learned.
Yeah, because
but that can sometimes come across
to compare it to in your own experience.
Yeah, so sometimes it can come across, and you know, that maybe I don't understand for some people, and actually that couldn't be truer. And I know it's a conversation we've had before, Chris, when people say lack of empathy, and that's not true. Well, for me personally,
to add here as well, I find it really interesting, and I do agree that it's the impact on the individual that is important. But I also want to recognise the layers of abuse, whether you're experiencing it yourself or whether you're witnessing it.
no.
And often those who have been abused within the family home, outside the family home, there is often with that some kind of neglect that goes on, and with that there may come the bullying at school because you look different, you smell different. There may be other layers added on that your parents have suffering addiction and a mental health. So it's never just one thing, it's often multiple things in people's lives that you might understand and connect with one cause or link. But if you start looking and digging deeper, there's often many causal links that are overlapping. And it's not until you maybe have dealt with one particular condition or symptoms and got to understand one level of what's been done against you, and then another one pops up, and then a whole different story unfolds, and that's what you then need to deal with. So there are some people, victims, survivors, that I've come across personally, who don't see a future, that don't see that they can get out of where they are, and truly believe that there isn't a recovery pathway. And I can understand where they're coming from and why they think that. But all we can keep doing, Elaine, as what you said, is keep spreading the words, keep showing up, being a role model, and keep saying that recovery is possible. And if you don't see it now, keep working towards it, and one day something will help you turn your life around, however small.
Yeah, that is such an important message. You know, since we added the questions onto the health profile and it opened it right up into the community, it, you know, I always think I've heard it all, and I haven't, you know. Then someone else will tell me something else that they experienced that is so shocking. And so I'm so glad though that I've got this, because I wouldn't have known where to go with that or what to do with it. I wouldn't have known. And you know, with chronic fatigue, I've experienced it. ME, I've experienced it. It's lots of things I've experienced. I've been through a divorce. I've lost a child. There's lots of things I can empathize with. But actually having this I think on the one hand, it's horrendous that there's so much that children have experienced, and you know, the adults of that. I think that's what I realized in Scotland, was that they're dealing very much with the children and the teens, and I was sitting there thinking, we're picking up the pieces from the adult fallout, and we've got to know what to say and do. And so, you know, I put together a course that I'm really proud of, actually, and it's the what to say and do, so that people can confidently open the conversation or respond to the conversation, but also have the pathways to be able to guide people on and signpost them, so that you don't have to become, I'm not a trauma release expert by any means. That's not my thing. My background's education, coaching, training, but I don't shirk or shrink from those conversations anymore. People feel comfortable being able to say things, and I have places to send people where they are going to be understood, you know, and have some options of what to do. And I think that there's always hope. Where there's life, there's hope. I totally believe that. And what's the alternative? That's what I always say to people. What's the alternative? You know, you are here, and if you're here, then, you know, you're getting up every day, and good on you for that. And you're struggling and carrying all this. So, you know, there are people that can help now. There's massive understanding. There's massive awareness now. It's not hidden away in the closet like it used to be. So I really believe that we are turning the corner with that. And that's what you were trying to get me to talk about, Bev, was what I did. I woke up early hours of the morning a few months ago, and I just thought, I wonder if ACE Aware UK website is available. And I don't know where that came from. I went online and and it hadn't been taken. So I thought, right, I purchased it. And the next day I spoke to somebody about, would they be interested in sponsoring the first ACE Aware UK conference, with getting Scotland involved, because why reinvent the wheel? They've done wonders. Let's get them in and tell us what they did, so that we can all take it forward. And both of those things have happened. We've got someone very interested in being that sponsor. I don't know if that's going to actually be the sponsor, but they're really keen. And I've already spoken to Scotland and the people that started it there, and they've offered us so much help. And so, you know, I'm looking at my succession when I eventually move on from the Chrysalis Effect. I know that trauma is going to be my future, because it has just been a gift to understand this and be able to share this, because people having these light bulb moments and regaining their health is priceless. You know, because for the next generation and the generation after that. And that's why I'm so, you know, so blessed to know you ladies with the work that you do as well. And I know that we're all going to be working together to make the UK that have the infrastructure around this, like Scotland have already done, and that needs to go out worldwide.
And that's fantastic. And I have to say, I didn't even have to remind you about the time, but what a way to end this episode, which is fantastic. But for me, I always say it's about listening to the adult child. So it's the child in the adult, but also the adult in the child, because children are experiencing emotions that you, even as an adult, we don't want to experience, you know, whether it be through death, grief, whether it be through separation. You know, it's not all for abuse, but it happens, and pretending it doesn't happen doesn't help anybody. So, you know, by being able to have these conversations, by not being scared of it, really helps everybody. You know, our children are our future leaders. So last thoughts there. So, you know, I'll give you a little bit of a rest for a minute, Elaine. Chris, any last thoughts before we end this episode?
Yeah, I wanted to end it on a high, but I think I need to just make this little statement. So as we've been sitting here, obviously we don't script what we're going to say. We have an idea of what each podcast is going to be, but just listening to all of this, there is hope because there is life. However, there is a lot of harm been perpetrated against children and young people that's gone on for generations, still happening today. We know about the trauma impacts. we know the cost to the society, to the UK, across all our health systems, across our educational systems. We know the long-term harmful impacts to all areas of the victim, survivors, individuals' life. We know all of that. We've got all of the evidence. Yet the government, no matter who they are, have to implement ICSA recommendations. And I know I'm tagged that onto the end of this brilliant podcast, but the fact that we're not actually implementing recommendations from the end of an 8-year, £186 million inquiry into child sexual abuse, its prevalence and its impact astounds me, when we've just spent an hour talking about what we've shared. So that is my parting message, Bev, is that if this doesn't make people sit up and take action and want something different for the next generation, I don't know what will. And we will always, all of us, work towards what we're doing in the best way that we can. But even having this podcast to share this information and keep going back to the work that's already been done and the work that we want to do, it needs political will in what I'm saying, not what Elaine's saying, but what I'm saying. It needs political will, and society needs to understand the damage and the cost. And when they do, they will then all step up and say zero tolerance to all forms of abuse, all forms of bullying, and let's prevent traumas happening in the first place as much as we can.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. So, Elaine, before we finish, your final words for yourself. We've given you a minute to think about. And literally, it's encompassing everything. Your last thoughts before we finish this episode.
Well, I'm really heartened by the way now. I just go back to when I first started talking about ME and chronic fatigue. When I went into a room, I used to say, does anyone here know anybody who's got ME and chronic fatigue, or do you know anything about it? And a couple of little hands would go up. As the years have gone by, I can do that in a room now and everybody puts their hands up. You know, since the pandemic, long COVID has brought chronic fatigue to the fore. I think that's where we're getting to with trauma. Eventually we will reach that momentum around this, and the political will, Chris, is exactly what Scotland have managed to do. It comes from the top, and that's why we need we need Scotland to help us so that we can connect the counterparts from Scotland with the counterparts in the UK to actually make this work, this tireless work that you do to bring this awareness at, you know, a whole other level, at government level. And perhaps Earl Spencer's book and his position in society, you know, if he's spoken out, he's also spoken on behalf of those other 75 kids in that boarding school. And you can imagine you know, what that's going to do, and the connections that those people are going to have. And he's been personally thanked by or friends that have been school friends, long-term school friends, personally thanked that he'd never been able to divulge anything to his wife, and he told her after 40 years, and they both cried for an hour together. These are going to be people who are in the judiciary. These are going to be people that are in politics. So I think that this is the zeitgeist. This is the time, because for his book to be released now, that takes us into that echelon of society, the people that hold the power. And I'm really positive about that.
Yeah. And that's, you know, thank you, because it is about bringing this all together. For anybody listening, you know, as always, self-care. If you've got any more questions you want to ask, please contact us on breakingthecycle2stepforward@gmail.com. We will be putting some links underneath. So we'll be putting the links about, obviously, the Chrysalis Effect, the documentary film, The Resilience. It's really fantastic because you forget some of these things. I remember, you know, the very first time one of the Kent schools was actually showing resilience, and I was hosting that panel for the Q&A. And then there was a second school that hosted, you know, and when I think where we've come from there, you know, even in the last 10 years, where we've come from, you know, this spoke the word trauma and people just didn't want to talk to you. So thank you, you know, so much. This is something we're very passionate about, and look after yourself, everybody. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much, Elaine, for coming on, and we'll speak to you again.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.